Okay, it is now 1:30, and so I resume the hearing. And as promised, before our adjournment, I'll look to the Council for its reply.
Thank you. Can I say we're chasing the formal responses from Historic England and Natural England? I've seen the emails. They're informal at the moment, but they've said they will provide them. I'm hoping I'll do so quickly. I will touch on them briefly when I respond. Can I begin by saying this? There are understandably a number of issues that have been raised, particularly by the parish council's local residents, which are perfectly understandable as issues. The difficulty is, as you know, is that the council's got to balance a whole series of considerations, not least the government's policy for increased housing, meeting the OAN and employment needs of the city, and other considerations. It inevitably means that difficult judgments have got to be made, and the nature of those judgments is set out at considerable length, as you know, in the sustainability appraisal. Let me give you, for example, the spatial criteria, which Mr. Corsair referred to for, I think, one of the many times he's made the same submissions, and I'll come back to that, are set out in the sustainability appraisal for the the Regulation 19 Draft Local Plan, which is the one you're looking at, which is CD 9A to 9D. Each of the sites that was considered, including those which were not taken forward, were assessed against the spatial policies. They were then looked at against a whole range of criteria. And turning to this particular site, the various factors are then scored against the various criteria, and that's in core document CD 9B. And you will find there the various issues, including impact, greenfield against brownfield, loss of agricultural land of grade 3 quality, and the various alternatives that were considered in that context. For example, different versions of ST13 which took more greenfield or more brownfield land, took less agricultural land. Those were all appraised in the sustainability appraisal, and you'll see that set out at length in CD 9B. I'll give you the page references in a moment, since my computer's decided to close it down. There we go. Yes, ST15 starts in CD 9B at Appendix I, page I114, through to I138, which are PDFs, PDF pages 133 to 157. And you'll find there a discussion. And none of the points that has been raised, we would say, are showstoppers in the sense of pointing to a deletion of this site. They're all matters of balanced judgment which have been balanced in the plan process. For example, the decision to move the allocation further away from the trunk road, the ring road, and to move it further to the east. That was a decision made in 2016. I majored on this at some length in phase 2. And lest Mr. Corsair have forgotten about it, I set it out at tedious length in my response to his submissions on the sustainability appraisal, which is CYC 84. Mr. Corsair is merely, in a lot of the points he makes today, for example, merely repeating what he has said on a number of occasions. And one of the points which I will illustrate in CYC 84, is his allegation, which I indicated was wrong, that the impact of the infrastructure outside the site allocation had not been considered. That is simply wrong. And if he bothered to read the note I'd put in, I've not only given you the references, I've actually quoted it. You'll find it in CYC 84, and the reference to the off-site infrastructure begins at paragraph 31B, and I've quoted from the strategic sustainability appraisal at I-120 to 122, which starts, "This is a new garden village and consequently requires significant infrastructure to ensure it promotes sustainable travel behaviour and has good connectivity to the rest of York." And the quote goes on for about a page. So a lot of the points Mr. Corsier raises, he raises again and have already been answered. And therefore I'm going to direct you back to my note for an answers in relation to those matters. I'm not going to address OAN and employment numbers. Those are matters you've got information on and will reach your own views. Second issue, so far as the nature conservation matters are concerned, and again, I understand the concerns that are raised, but they have been considered. Natural England does not raise objection. Mitigation has been agreed in principle and will be considered in detail, not now, but as part of any master planning and planning application process. And this goes to another Mr. Corsier's points about, well, how can you be sure it'll all be delivered properly? Because, of course, we require a master plan, and it's in the opening paragraph to SS13. And there will be appropriate conditions and obligations imposed to ensure delivery of local facilities, including the schools, as part of a phased development, as is the case with virtually any large housing site. The answer to Mrs. Hilton and the concerns about the SSSI, firstly, Strensel is not relevant to that because Strensel is a special area of conservation, as you know, and therefore it attracts the higher test in the habitats regulations. The SSSI, although it's part of Strensel Common, doesn't attract the same test. However, one of the issues which will have to be considered as part of the planning application is the protection of the SSSI. And therefore that is flagged up. And if it requires prevention of access at certain points in order to avoid recreational damage, then of course there is that degree of overlap with concerns that are raised with regard to Strensel, but that has been highlighted in the policy criteria and it has Natural England's support. As for the avoidance of SINCs, policy GI2, which is local plan at page 166, does not...
Apologies, if you just allow me to catch up.
I'm sorry.
And now I've forgotten what you said.
Which bit did you forget?
Just the sentence you were just starting.
Yes, sorry. With regard to SINCs, there is not a ban on them. GI2 in the local plan, page 166, says that they should be avoided, but where there's a need for development, then they should be mitigated and, as a last resort, compensated for. Those factors, part of the spatial principles, are part of the assessment process of the sites. And you'll find that, of course, let me get it. It's in the sustainability appraisal, CD9A. and you'll see the spatial strategy matrix, which refers to all of the spatial strategy policies at Appendix F, and the site selection methodology for both residential and employment sites at Appendix G. This includes consideration of the environmental assets, and it flags up areas which are of importance in this context, which includes the green infrastructure corridors that were mentioned. You'll find that at figure 1.3 in Appendix G, which is PDF page 220. And the flow diagram, which takes you through the various criteria which are then applicable in terms of the environmental assets, is at section 2.5 of Appendix G, beginning on PDF page 225. And you will see it includes matters such as the green belt, ancient woodlands, green infrastructure corridors, SINCs and sites of local interest, and other features which are identified in Appendix G. And then you may remember there's an accessibility criteria that are applied there as well, and then how the most sustainable sites have been sought. So these criteria, the spatial criteria and the environmental assets, which include most of the points of concern that have been raised today, are all part of the matrix of considerations which had to be balanced in selecting the sites for allocation. And in that context, it should also be borne in mind that there isn't simply the 2014 Heritage topic paper, but there is the 2017 Heritage Impact Assessment. And you'll recall I referred you to that yesterday in the context of ST7. And that is SD 101 and SD 102. SD 101, which my computer helpfully closed down, deals with ST15 on page 37 to 40, and for a wonder, the PDF pages correspond to the written page numbers. I think it's the first time we found that in this examination. And you'll see that issues such as the large incursion into the open countryside would clearly affect the openness of the green belt, harm to certain elements, etc., is one of the issues considered, compactness, and other relevant features. There is, at SD 102, and again I referred to it yesterday, Appendix A, are in tabulated form historic England's representations with regard to SD14, yes, ST15, PDF page 154. My computer's closed that one down as well for some reason. Excuse me. Thank you. Right. And you'll find, well, it was then English Heritage, but Historic England's representations start at PDF page 56. And you'll see that they include the question of the setting and of access routes and of Minster Way. And those are all matters that are considered in the Heritage Impact Assessment, which then feeds into the sustainability appraisal. So the features that have been highlighted as of concern today are all legitimate points, but they have already formed part of the assessment of the various sites and the basis of the comparative assessment which led to the designation, or sorry, the allocation rather, of the sites that are in the plan. I've already mentioned the impact on Greenbelt and the countryside of the off-site road infrastructure. Can I just remind you, as Celia Brown reminded me earlier, local transport infrastructure, where it's necessary, is appropriate development in the Greenbelt. NPPF 2012, paragraph 90. And in the current NPPF, which would be the relevant one for development management purposes, the same paragraph appears at paragraph 150, subparagraph C. So it's not a foregone conclusion that local infrastructure improvements are inappropriate development in the Greenbelt in any event. Education I addressed earlier. And the suggestion by at least two of those making representations that if the site has to be here, it should be larger. Well, that is addressed in the essay by the consideration of alternatives. And you'll recall, and I gave you this yesterday in the context of SD7, the Appendix K, which is the route map through the various iterations of the sustainability appraisal of how the site emerged. But this size of site is supported by Historic England, but they reject on impact on the setting of York and from the ring road, which you know from SD7 yesterday, they regard views from the ring road of the city to be of particular concern. They've made that perfectly clear in their Rec 19 representations, which is SID 118, which is, all right, let me just get it, it's CD 14C, and the representations begin at PDF page 159. ST15 appears at PDF pages 184 to 186. Internal pagination 25 to 27. And the last paragraph is Historic England would oppose any increase in the size of this settlement over and above that currently proposed, because of the harm that this would cause to numerous elements which contribute to the special character and setting of York. Historic England endorsed the change in the location of the new settlement. You'll recall it was adjacent to the ring road and was pulled back in 2016 in the preferred options assessment. That is specifically endorsed by Historic England. And they say, a strategy in which part of York's development needs are met in a new freestanding settlements beyond the ring road might help safeguard the size and compact nature of the historic city the perception of York being a freestanding historic city set within a rural hinterland, key views towards York from the Ring Road, and the relationship of the main built-up area to the surrounding settlements. That's in the Reg 19, Reps SID 118, core document 14C at page PDF 185, internal page 26. The Historic England email, which you will get, confirming what they've emailed us about informally, is they remain of that position. That does not apply. They're content to have the additional allocation for the secondary school should it be required, but no further, effectively. I appreciate I haven't addressed every point as a matter of detail, but as I've said, the details in terms of impact on the countryside, the rural area, the green belt, public rights of way, those are all matters that are balanced in the considerations that I've touched on in terms of the sustainability appraisal and the various factors which have gone into site assessment. So I hope no one thinks that I'm ignoring them by doing it comprehensively. The only other point I want to ask, and I'm going to ask Mr. Ridge to deal with this, is some points were made by Mr. Corsier about transport provision, and I just want to ask Mr. Ridge to deal with that. Before I do that, are there any other specific matters you'd like me to address out of these issues?
Not for now, certainly.
Thank you.
Okay, yes. In terms of transport, so there were a number of points made by Mr. Corsier about transport and ST15 and ST15's ability to be sustainable in transport terms. One of them was around the idea that there'd be very little cycling off-site. We don't think that's the case. We think the university is an ideal cycling distance from ST15. And the fact that around 25% of the trips from ST15 are currently forecast to be going to the university makes us think that cycling will be a very viable mode for that journey, as will travelling by bus. And we should remember that the university is an area where parking is controlled. So it has both carrots in the form of the infrastructure that we're going to provide and also sticks in terms of how parking is controlled on the site. There was a reference to 74% of trips leaving the site from private car. I think that is a reference to the table on page 77 of the ST15 Sustainable Transport Study. In fact, it's a slight misrepresentation of what's shown in the table. In fact, the table, first of all, we should be clear that the table is not a series of targets for transport from ST15. This is in fact simply a recitation of the scenario that we tested in our model, which was a stress test to see how the network responds. So we would look to have higher targets than the ones that we tested for the actual development, which we would enact through the Green Travel Plan. But secondly, actually, even that scenario has 68% of trips from the site being by car driver. The other 6%, which Mr. Corsier adds to the 68% to make 74%, is actually car passengers. So they're not. So it's not to say that they're individual trips. There's been a lot of discussion about highways infrastructure and whether or not that should be lit. I think we need to be very clear that these days there are a number of ways of lighting highway infrastructure. If we take that view and if we feel it's necessary to light things like the grade-separated junctions so that they can be used by pedestrians and cyclists, we could achieve that by low-level, ground-level lighting rather than overhead lighting. And obviously ground-level lighting would have a much, much lower impact on dark skies. There was a series of comments about viability and the capital sums, and I may pass over to our colleagues from LDP on this, but within our viability statement, or viability work that we did, we used indicative sums, which were loosely based on unit costs for developing roadways. LDP has done a great deal more QS-based work on those costs as part of its own viability work, and has come up with some very similar numbers to those that we use in our viability testing. So we stand by the numbers that are in the viability statement. There's one particular comment made in Mr. Corsier's written representation, which makes the point that the link road on Elvington Lane, where they straighten out various bends and provide a new junction, will cost £25 million. We don't believe that is the case. We believe it's a relatively short stretch of road. It's only about 600 metres. The junction itself is relatively straightforward. It's a flat junction with signals. We don't believe that £25 million is an appropriate cost for that piece of infrastructure. It would mean that that piece of infrastructure is costing about a third of what we're paying to dual 9 kilometres of the outer ring road. So we think that £5 million is an appropriate level for that. And I think that concludes what I wanted to say. Unless you have any questions, sir.
Just on viability, I'd be interested to be reminded about how debt funding is treated.
So I can respond to that question. We treat debt funding as 100%. So all the assumptions for the testing is based on 100% debt borrowing, and the appraisals are cash flowed on a monthly basis. Typically, infrastructure costs in the general testing was front-loaded at the first half of the development. Subsequently, when we've looked at site-specific information, we've taken into account the phasing plans that both the site promoters and the council have assumed for that specific site to assess whether that impact on viability. And that is referenced in a recent note we prepared in CYC 99C for this hearing. And in that, it shows the viability is there and there is still headroom remaining.
There are a couple of extra points which I forgot to cover. As I said, in my response to Mr. Corsier on, well, how do you know it's going to be delivered? Well, I've already made that answer. Master plan, conditions, section 106, etc. And of course, highways 278, if necessary. I was going to point to the fact that viability evidence is agreed, and indeed it appeared not in the Statement of Common Ground, but in Quad's Appendix 17 to its hearing statement, so it's been available for some time. I've already said I addressed a number of these points in CYC 84, and I simply disagree with Mr. Corsier that there has been a lack of evidence for a number of issues for the reasons I've already indicated. One needs, obviously, to read the sustainability appraisal in detail, and I appreciate that that is not always easy. But Mr. Corsier is a professional, so I feel I can be harder on him than on the parish councils who are doing it out of the public good for their own communities. The other point I wanted to address was the issue of equalisation. It is legally irrelevant, and I put it as high as that. I've advised on these issues in the past when local authorities have sought to impose equalisation arrangements. It is a matter for the landowners how they resolve land values and the payment of infrastructure costs between themselves. They will have to sign up to a master plan and planning conditions and obligations, which gives the local authority the control over the progress and delivery of the site and secures all necessary benefits, mitigations, and other required features. However, as a matter of internal agreement about who gets what profit, who pays for which proportion of infrastructure, that is nothing to do with the local authority, providing that it secures in the public interest what policy and good planning requires. And as I've said, I am familiar with these issues. They arise in the context of planning applications, not in the context of local plans, and they're matters for private arrangements. If the authority sought to impose equalisation, it would effectively be expropriating the value of private land by insisting one landowner passed it to another, which it simply can't do. It's a long way of saying it's legally irrelevant, but it's a matter for the landowners how they arrange it. All we're interested in doing is securing delivery in the public interest. Thank you.
Mr. Merritt.
Yes, I'd just like to come back on two particular aspects, one on the size and the other in terms of the sustainability appraisal. If I could remind the Council the points that were made when we discussed the sustainability appraisal previously, I think we fairly well demonstrated that the sustainability appraisal is deeply flawed in terms of the transport aspects. If you turn to page 229 of CD 009, where the stage 1 process...
CD 009, A, B, C or D?
Sorry, A.
A, thank you.
Stage 1 process in terms of the minimum residential transport score, stage 1, is non-frequent bus route within 800 metres, access to an adopted highway, access to a cycle route, minimum score 9 points. You will notice from that actually, in principle, York Central, next to the railway station, which we've proposed cycle routes, access to bus, etc., would in principle score exactly the same as ST15 once it's got the services provided that are proposed in it. What this test doesn't do is actually test how those facilities will be used and whether you will actually get substantial take-up of active travel, bus, etc., in order to deliver it. So, in fact, in terms of a sort, the transport aspects there's no realistic differentiation of whether a site is in the heart of the city or remote from it. Sorry, and on the size, my other point on the size, obviously we have equally challenged the under-provision of housing in the city as a whole, particularly because of the student issues, the Airbnb, and the massive affordable housing crisis in this city.
Yeah, I'm not going to go back onto those issues.
I just want to flag the point. So there is going to be a need for extra space somewhere.
Mr. Corsier.
Thank you, sir. I'll try and be relatively brief on my response to Mr. Elvin. Certainly, sir, we accept that alternatives have been looked at through the SA. There seems to be a confusion in the Council's mind between the purpose, they conflate a claim in the SA with evidence, and our point is that in generality, many of the claims in the SA about impacts are not backed by evidence, and we've made that point to you before, sir, so I won't repeat it. In terms of Mr. Elvin taking me to task about his response, which I think was CYC 84, my point isn't that there isn't some oblique reference in the SAA to the fact that there may be a need for off-site road infrastructure for ST15. It's the fact that it is not part of the appraisal. So there's no attempt to actually look at its impacts on the environment. And so I've clearly read Mr. Elvin's response, and I've actually written back to you with, my comments on that. So I would just simply ask you to look at what Mr. Elvin quotes, whether that actually is an adequate essay of many kilometres of new road, sir, which is affecting some of the most sensitive landscapes around York. In fact, Mary referenced that there is a need for some off-site road infrastructure isn't sufficient in my mind. And so the same comments apply to the HIA. And indeed, sir, my reference, if I remember, is 59.6. So I think I dealt with this point about the relationship between SS1 and GI2 when I spoke. SS1, sir, and the text company is to deal with where development is to be guided. GI2, sir, is dealing with applications received for development after plan adoption. They fulfill different functions. And Mr. Elvin's attempt to rely on GI2 is my view, simply mistaken. So again, there may be some references to green infrastructure in documentation. You have no assessment. I go back to my initial point. There is no assessment of the impact of SD15 upon green infrastructure in itself. You have, in fact, very little evidence about it. Again, the highest Mr. Elvin can claim, it has been assessed against an SA objective. I'm sorry, I'm just looking at my notes of what Mr. Elvin said. Dealing with the local transport infrastructure, sir. Yes, that can be an appropriate form of development. But, sir, that is caveated by the note, provided they preserve the openness of the greenbelt and do not conflict with the purposes of including land in greenbelt. And so, in setting that, I am always very low to get into matters of law with Mr. Elvin. And I've just mislaid.
Quite wise, I should imagine.
But sir, I am tempted to do that here, sir. I'm not going to try and debate the meaning of a case, so I would just ask you to look at it. I think it's still current law. It's the case of R on the application of Liverpool Open and Green Space Community Interest Company and Liverpool City Council. And so the reference to that is 2020 EWCA Civ 861. And so that makes exactly the point I'm making, is when you're looking at the impacts on openness, so you go beyond just saying, is it the categories in paragraph 90, sir, those 5 bullet points. You have to look upon more wider matters, including, sir, the visual impact. And so that's I could just say what Lord Justice Lindblom, I think, said in bullet point 5. There was no indication in paragraphs 87 to 890 of the NPPF that the aim of preserving the openness of the greenbelt excludes consideration of visual as well as physical or spatial impact. So when you're looking at the visual impacts...
apologies, Mr. Corsia. Yeah, do you have a paragraph?
Oh, sorry, I should have said that's paragraph 33. Unfortunately, the majority of the case doesn't deal with issues in front of you. It's just almost entirely confined to that paragraph. we think you should look at the visual impact of the road infrastructure and the effects upon the various matters of purposes before, and so we think if you do that, sir, you will find a substantially harmful impact upon the purposes of the Greenbelt, including openness. And so there are, I think, a number of decisions, appeal decisions, etc., which find that access roads in the Greenbelt are inappropriate development on the basis of that reasoning, sir. I'm sorry, sir, I'm just looking through my notes. In terms of the I don't think there's any yes, sorry, can I just deal with that development value equalisation point? I fully accept Mr. Elvin is completely right that how it's done, sir, is not a matter for the local planning authority. What is important for you, sir, is to know that this site is deliverable. And where you have three landowners, you need to, I think two are, as far as we can read the statement of common ground, two appear to be in agreement. The third is standing aside at the present moment in terms of agreeing on how this site should be developed. In those situations, sir, this site will not come forward unless there is an agreement between those landowners how they are going to divide that land value. It's immaterial to you whether one landowner takes all the value or whatever, sir, but it is material to you, sir, that there is an agreement on that point, because otherwise this site will not come forward. I think that's as much as I want to say at this point, sir.
Just on the legal point, I wonder if the Supreme Court judgment in Samuel Smith Old Brewery is relevant.
So the decision I've just quoted you is post that decision, sir, and quotes that decision in its reasoning.
I did wonder about that because they're both from 2020, aren't they?
Yes, sir. In fact,
Mr. Corsia is wrong because they quote the Court of Appeal in Samuel Smith.
If I'm wrong with Mr. Elvin, I fully accept that, but...
Yeah, Mr. Merritt. Very good. Mrs. Hilton.
Thank you. Just to pick up Mr. Elvin's point that the SSSI is a lower status environmental conservation site than the SPA site at Strensall. I fully understand that. I hadn't completely understood that meant the criteria for protection were different, not being anything to do with planning until the last few weeks. I'm learning.
Welcome to my world, Mrs. Hilton.
You're very lucky not to have had to deal with it before.
I don't expect to stay in planning very long. However, I can do sums, and I still would like to point out that although it might be a lower status, and it is a lower status, and therefore maybe different law applies, the fact is that we're still looking at around triple the population who will be accessing the site. And we've been very generous in the numbers. We've included in there the 7,000 odd students resident on the campuses in Heslington, or they will be there from September. And that's the point. Even though they're there only half the year, we've still included them in our figures. So, triple is really a conservative estimate of the additional population that will feed into visiting those sites. And so we think it is not appropriate to design into the allocation, if it is approved, an increase of likely footfall onto the triple SI. When I say footfall, I include pedal fall as well. It's been specifically designed, and Natural England said in their submission in 2017 regarding SS13 that Heslington-Tilmar triple SI is of the mitigation of recreational impacts on the Heslington-Tilmar triple SI is of the utmost importance, and especially in the context of such a large allocation in such a sensitive location. And in addition, in the policy SS13, point 17, struggling with my Romans, it does say about increasing and promoting cycle and pedestrian travel in the site and out of the site. So we've got a perfect storm, if you like, of a sensitive area which is not sensitive enough, a strong push towards active travel, which Heslington Parish fully supports. We just think it needs to be balanced against the needs of the area. And we have a design which sets out to increase the numbers and also brings in, as I said before, population from other areas. Thank you.
Ms. Cook.
Thank you very much, sir. Can I just come back to Mrs. Hilton's comments, if I may, about the SSSI, because I wanted to draw attention to the fact that in Chapter 6 of my matter statement and in Appendix 16, particularly the last 2 pages of Appendix 16, which is from Peak Ecology, they discuss this SSSI. And it's these points.
Yes, apologies, Ms. Cook. Whereabouts?
If you go to Appendix 16 in my matter statement, the last 2 pages of that from Peak Ecology touches on this SSSI, and ST15 at its closest point is 1 kilometre. And so you may recall that, at one stage I was promoting a slightly different site, a slightly larger site, and my site was closer originally to the SSSI than ST15 is now. And it's always been in Natural England's eye, as it were, the impact on the SSSI, which is why we have Area 5. If you recall that plan I took you to right at the beginning, we have Area 5, which is known as, it's 32 hectares odd, and it's to the west of ST15, and it is to be enhanced, and it is part and parcel of a strategy which will, the detail of which will come forward with the application, but it's part of a strategy to keep residents, as it were, and their various pets away from that SSSI. And you also should bear in mind you have a statement from Natural England in respect of this matter. And again, it's paragraph 7.1 of the Natural England response where they confirm that they are satisfied as to the impacts on, amongst other things, the SSSI. So it's not forgotten. Mrs. Hilton is quite right that as a matter of fact, there are public footpaths on 3 sides of it. But that's not to say that there won't be a strategy for seeking to protect that coming forward. So that's one point I just wanted to come back on. Second point of detail, Mr. Corsia appeared to have a bit of a swipe, at least I thought it was a bit of a swipe, about education and when the primary schools might come forward. And I would refer you to Appendix 12 of my matter statement, where EFM, I constantly want to call them ERM because of the rock band, which I'm a fan, they produced a table of child yields. And this is based on...
If you bear with me just one moment. So is that Appendix 11?
It's Appendix 12, sir, according to my note. Should be a coloured graph, or a table, rather than a graph, a table.
I have that table in front of me now.
And that shows that on our delivery rates, the first of the 2 primary schools coming forward in the 2nd year after the housing completions begin. Now, obviously, the detail of that will be a matter for an application, but I just wanted you to see that that has been the subject of detailed expert assessment on my side of the fence. The other thing I wanted to just draw attention...
Sorry, Ms. Cook, do we have any objection to that from the local education authority?
I don't think there's any objection from CYC are the education authority. I don't think there's any objection. I think the only difference between us is we're back to this policy point, but that really goes to spelling out the 2-form entry and the 3-form entry. It doesn't go to the actual timing of the delivery. I think the council's position is they would expect all of that to come forward in the planning application and the master plan. So, if I may, the next thing I just wanted to draw to your attention was my Appendix 10, because we too have looked at sustainable transport, and I particularly just wanted to draw attention to page 5. So this is a document prepared by 4 Consulting, who've been acting for the landowners in relation to sustainable transport, and they've been talking to the local bus companies. And on page 5 of Appendix 10, they explain what it is in terms of their discussions with the bus companies is envisaged in terms of, to begin with, extending services in via Elvington Lane. So again, I'm just wanting to draw to your attention that it's not just a matter of the council's evidence base, it's also a matter of the evidence in front of you from me on behalf of the promoters, the site promoters, when it comes to sustainable travel, all of which has been fed into our assessment of viability. And then last but not least, in what I think is another swipe, in the statement of common ground, at paragraph 2, there is an explanation. This is the one piece of evidence I conceded this morning was new, but there's a clear explanation about who LDP are and the fact that LDP effectively is formed by two parties, and there's a plan which shows you that those two parties are effectively in control of the lion's share, shall we say, of ST15. And the plan also shows you that the other party is A1 Plant and Haulage. And they are, this is a statement of common ground between CYC, Langwith Development Partnership, and A1 Plant and Haulage. All three of us have signed up to this statement of common ground. When I say three, I mean on my side of the room. I've got effectively three landowners. And as it happens, Mr. Johnston, sitting on the other side of the room, happens to act for A1 Plant and Haulage, and all he needs to do, I think, at this point is nod at me, if I may say so. Just to confirm, because I think Mr. Corsi is completely misunderstood. He seems to have thought that the statement of common ground is just between two of effectively the landowners, not three, and that's just simply not right. That's it, sir. You've heard enough from me, I think.
If he wasn't going to have a swipe at you, I don't think there'd be much point in Mr. Corsier coming. Mr. Corsier.
Very briefly, sir. Sorry, I'll deal with the point I've got in the initial point in reverse order. The question of the statement from, I can't remember the name of the consultancy, I think it was for the Public Transport and Active Mode Strategy, which is Appendix 10 of LDP's report. Page 5, sir. The bus company, there has been discussions with bus companies, but from my reading of that, the main interest has been in providing a bus service once the grade separated junction has been put in. I may have read it wrongly, sir, but that certainly seems to be where the emphasis in this document is. So in terms of the primary school, delivery of the primary school, the figure I quoted you as 380 dwellings is, of course, what the council says in its most recent infrastructure programme. The assertion that lost my reference to it in the LDP document, the assertion that it could be provided earlier would mean that the school would be about half full on the date of opening. And so you'll recall, and unfortunately I don't have the reference to you, but it's in the latest iteration of the council's IDP, there is a clear statement by the education authority saying that they would not want that to happen. They would want to make sure they use I think their words, use resources wisely. Unfortunately, I haven't got the reference there, but I'm sure you can remember that. We do quote it in a statement we've given to you on the latest version of the IDP. Just to avoid any confusion, so whilst Mr. Elvin was talking about this Liverpool Open and Green Spaces community interest, unless I'm totally misreading it, the Court of Appeal there actually specifically quotes the Samuel Smith.
You're right. I read the fact they were quoting them. Lord Justice Lindblom was quoting himself, given he'd had a smack over the back of the hands by Lord Carnwath in the Supreme Court. But he was just pulling back from that. But I'll deal with that in a moment.
I'm happy with that as long as it's accepted. It post-states the Samuel Smith case.
So, do you mind if I just come back? Page 4 on I'm back into my appendix
Your
10.
appendix 10, yeah.
Yeah. Page 4 talks about 4 have initiated discussions with First Bus and East Yorkshire Motor Service, and it says to establish a range of options. Given this dialogue and the information provided by the local bus operators, the recommended approach is initially in phase 1 to fund a bespoke bus service. The top of page 5 is the services that I was referring to. So the idea is to fund those as part of phase 1. So it's bus from the outset via phase 1.
Mr. Alvin.
Before Mr. Corsi gets too excited about the legal point, my first point on this was that it was already considered in the sustainability appraisal, i.e. the fact that there would be new infrastructure, and I gave you the references. And it's not just a passing sentence, it's a page, and it's in my note, CYC 84, and I'm not going to repeat it. And Mr. Corsier may wish to regard that as a passing reference, but it doesn't look like it to me. Secondly, I said one approach to this may be that it's not inappropriate development anyway. Of course you've got to assess it against openness. That's when we get to Liverpool and Samuel Smith. What Lord Carnworth said in the Supreme Court, correcting Lord Justice Lindblom in the Court of Appeal, is that whilst visual issues may be part of the issue of openness, they are not necessarily so. They're a matter of planning judgment. A common Lord Carnworth theme, indeed. That's Samuel Smith, paragraphs 39 to 41. They're not in the inquiry examination library. I'll send them to Carol, so they're there. It's paragraph 33 of Liverpool and paragraphs 39 to 41 of Samuel Smith. But it's only a side issue, because my first point is the issue of infrastructure is in the sustainability appraisal. Secondly, it may be appropriate development anyway, but of course it would still have to be assessed against openness and the need for the infrastructure, as paragraph 150 of the MPPF, current MPPF, recognises. Goes no further than that. The only other point I need to deal with is Mr. Merritt's suggestion that the essay was deeply flawed. I thought I dealt with this in phase 2. Page 229 of core document 9A is setting out a screening criterion, not an assessment criterion. It is not treating the British Sugar site as equivalent to ST15. It's just a screening tool. More detailed assessment takes place later, so it's not flawed. It's just Mr. Merritt has looked at one of the screening tools rather than the full assessment, and I've already referred you and given you references in core document 9B to the full assessment of ST15. Thank you.
Mrs. Hilton.
I just wanted to pick up on the issue about lighting again. I hear what Mr. Ridge said about having more subdued lighting being possible on the grade-separated junction and perhaps on roads as well. But the other issue is I know that Sustrans would advocate motion sensitive lighting on cycle routes that go cross country. But that doesn't really work in the country because of the night animals which set them off all the time. So whatever way you look at it, low level or motion sensitive, you are introducing artificial light into an area that currently has none. And I don't know if we're able to pick up a different topic around the status of OS 10 and the link to SSSI. As I understand it, the maintenance, if you like, of SSSI depends on grazing animals, and this is in the submission by Yorkshire Wildlife Trust in the 2017 consultation. And what I'm not clear about is how will grazing animals continue to be on the SSSI if there's no longer a farm where OS 10 currently is allocated? And who will be looking after any animals? How will they get there? Who will feed them, etc.? So that was just a question really about how the ongoing maintenance of the SSSI in terms of grazing would be managed if there was no longer a farm nearby. Thank you.
Can I get my ecologist to answer that, sir?
Hello there. Sorry, so my name label says Jonathan Brickland. I'm actually Jessica Eads.
Yeah, I was struggling to read the nameplate, and then when I did, it was something of a surprise.
So part of our discussions about the OS 10 habitat creation proposed and its long-term management, we have been in discussions with Yorkshire Wildlife Trust, who in principle, if the application gets put forward, are willing to take on the management role of that area.
And is that something that feeds into this local plan?
Yes, it does, sir, in terms of policy.
Did you have somewhere specific in mind, Ms. Cook, in the policy?
I'm just looking for it, sir, but I know that there's a criteria that requires us to demonstrate that, obviously, that there is no harm, but also that the long-term management and maintenance of both OS 10 and any retained areas is also another topic. Just give me a minute. Where is it? It's my Appendix 5, which is what I was just looking at.
368.
It's criterion 8, if that assists.
In SS13, is it criterion 7?
Yes, I'm not sure my numbering is entirely right, but yes, in terms of 7 deals with the SSSI and the Lower Derwent SPA, and then the new nature conservation area comes in the next bullet point. And there's some lowercase text. In the explanation. There's a bit of a discussion, as you might expect.
And I'll just add to that to suggest that the management and maintenance of that is secured by criterion 8, which follows.
as I have it, criterion 8's about Minster Way. I'm looking at, I know it's a rare thing to do these days, but I'm looking at the plan as originally submitted.
I think we're all looking at modifications, but in the modifications which are in my Appendix 5 and also in the Statement of Common Ground, so it's really criteria 6 through to 8, I think, that you need to focus on in terms of this particular issue. We've introduced a new one, which is why the numbering has changed.
In effect, it's the two provisions. The first, which requires the mitigation hierarchy to be applied with reference to the OS10, as Ms Cook has said, and then the requirement for the strategy to be agreed. And then that's followed with the next criterion, in my version, is 8, which then secures the management and maintenance.
Yeah, it says a long-term management plan, 30-year minimum. Is that the bit?
Correct, yes.
As you'll see from the proposed changes, the original 6 and 7 remain with a couple of additions to beef it up. Become, hence the reference, the 30-year minimum being added to what is now 8.
And it's those bits that have been added that secure Natural England's position of them being content with the proposals as they stand.
So from what I'm hearing, both the council and the site promoter are saying, in short, Mrs Hilton, you're quite right to point out that issue, but we have had our eye on it, as has Natural England, and we are proposing this solution. Is that about the size of it?
Indeed, yes.
Okay, thank you. Is there anything else that anyone wants to tell me about ST15?
Yeah, just one thing regarding disturbance on the triple SI. If the link road, pedestrian link road from ST15 joins the Minster Way also crosses the triple SI. So how can that possibly be mitigated while the Minster Way exists? Are they going to divert the Minster Way?
Mr Corsia.
Thank you, sir. I took it from your question, you want to move away totally from ST15, because I've confined my comments up to now on the principle of ST13 rather than actually policy SS13 if ST15 were to go ahead. I do have some comments on SS13, which don't go to the principle of the development.
Yep, okay, absolutely. Yeah, if you do have comments on the policy itself and the detail of now is most certainly the time. I'm kind of wondering which is the best version to look at, to be perfectly honest. It's very possibly the one in the Statement of Common Ground.
That's the one I have in front of me, sir, so hopefully that would be the most convenient for you.
No, okay, yeah, let us use that as the basis.
Sir, just I have to say, I think many of the drafting amendments are actually good drafting amendments, so I applaud the Council and LDP, because I do think it's probably a better overall policy. So, but just in with matters of where we actually disagree rather than on drafting, so is little 6, we think, given the nature and the aspirations of this site, simply going for the national minimum of 10% biodiversity gain, that should be higher, and we recommend at least 15% because LDP say they'll achieve 15%. So we think that should be higher. So we do object to 8 as it stands, which is a major change since the submitted version, which had that OS 10 had to be established 5 years prior to commencement. So it's now been suggested, I think, to it's just well, I thought it was 12 months. I may have misread it. I've certainly evidence refers to 12 months. It just say prior to commencement, deliver ecological and mitigation and compensation measures prior to commencement of any development. If it is indeed proposed to be 12 months, we think that's far too short. Over 12 months will not allow vegetation to be established or a habitat to be created which would provide a suitable alternative habitat for the ground nesting birds. Which this, or indeed do any form of replacement habitat. 12 months, it will still be mainly bare ground. It really will not